Welcome to my shop, and welcome to my series of videos on the basic and safe use of woodshop tools. In this video, we're going to be focusing on this tool, the router. And as you can see, I have a lot of them. I use the router quite a lot, and they're also a significant part of the business that I do with Alpine Trail Studio. I wanted to make this video for a long time, but it also makes me a little bit nervous because routers are complicated. They vary a lot from model to model. There's a lot that you can do with them, and so it's a fairly complicated process to know them all. In this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover routers in this form, handheld, and embedded into a router table, and I'm going to cover two of the basic types of cuts that you can do with them. I suspect there's a whole series of videos that you could do to cover all of the use cases. So I hope you'll join me as we learn a little bit more about these machines. We'll start with the things that you can do to adjust your router. The router base has two important functions. The first one is to attach it to the motor. So almost every one of these routers has a mechanism by which you can put the base onto the motor and tighten it down at a certain height. Usually that height is adjustable. And I can't go into the mechanism for every kind of router because so many of them do it so differently. The second function that it provides is the contact with the surface of the material that you're working on. And that's done with the router base plate. This base plate is a wide plate that I make myself. I sell a lot of them. But you can use a lot of different types of base plates. For instance, they have smaller ones like this, which is called a D plate, that gives you a flat surface to run along if you'd like to, or a rounded surface if that suits you. The most common plate is the round one. It probably came with your router. And you can even attach interesting things like this circle cutting jig. Really all you do is detach some screws from the base of the router to the base plate and put on whatever connection you would like to. There are also two main kinds of bases for a router. So let me take this compact router aside and show you some bases for a mid-sized router. This is the Bosch, and the router itself for this Bosch is actually in my router table, which you'll see shortly. But there are two kinds of bases for this. This one is a fixed base. And what that means is once I attach it to the router, I can make some micro adjustments, but once I start working, that's the height that I want my blade to be set at, and I just move it around. This one is called a plunge base. And the interesting thing about it is it has these little stands here that are on springs. And I can set a stop block for this so that I know how far it's going to move. But once I want to start working, I can push the blade into the material. On this one, it has a lock so it will stay there. And then I can start working with it. When I'm done, I can release it back up. So that's how bases work. Let me show you how blades are attached, the bits are attached to the collet and the shaft of the router. Now, as I show you how to put on a router bit, let's talk about the bits themselves. As you can see, there are a lot of varieties to the bits that you can use on a router, and they all have their own special function. This is only a small set, actually. And one of the important things to know about them is that they come in different shaft sizes. So these two router bits actually do roughly the same job. But this one is meant to go on a more powerful router and has a 1/2 inch shank, whereas this one goes on a 1/4 inch shank. My compact routers will only support the 1/4 inch shank because that's the size of their collet. Routers that support a 1/2 inch shank can actually have collets inserted into them so that they can do either one of these type of bits. One of the other aspects of a bit is its shape and whether or not it has a bearing on it. Bearings are meant to follow the side of wood or follow templates, and the cuts that we're going to do in this video make use of those bearings. Now let's talk about how you actually put the router bit on or take it off. And it's a fairly simple process. You may have had a wrench that came with your router, and if you've still got that, then great, but any wrench will usually do to help take off a bit. And then what you need to do is you need to get it so that this collet and shaft stop spinning so that you can loosen that collet and take out the bit. And this depends on the router, but normally there is a button somewhere. On this Milwaukee, it's this red button. And I twist it around until I feel it lock into place. And now this shaft is no longer going to spin freely. I can take my wrench up and I can loosen the collet. When that happens, a little more looser. Once that happens, the bit should come out easily. I can put a new one in. Hand tighten it, still holding this button down so it doesn't spin. Hand tighten it, and then take my wrench again and tighten it down so it won't move when it hits the resistance of the wood. That's how you insert bits. Make sure that that lock is no longer in place when we run it. That is how you insert the bits, and that's how you begin working with your router. So now you might be asking, how does the router table differ from what I just explained with the router? And the answer is not all that much. In fact, inside of this table is just a router. It has just a fancy mounting bracket on it, and it's sticking up rather than how you would normally work with it with the blade facing down. The only other main difference is that you have a table here, which is a nice flat surface, and you have the optional use of a fence. And that fence is we're going to use that fence in one of our cuts, and I'll show you how that changes things a little bit. Inside here, you actually see one of the bits that I talked about before with a bearing on it, and this one has the 1/2-inch shank. So let's do our first cut on this router table. So let's talk about the safety of making a cut using the router or router table. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the more material it cuts off, the more resistance you're going to have and the more difficult the cut is going to be. That's why I usually cut these shapes out using a bandsaw or a jigsaw before I take them into the router to be cut. That's similarly true if you're using it for a roundover. You usually don't want to start with a big 1.5-inch radius roundover bit. That would do a lot of material at one time. You can start instead by using smaller bits and work your way up to cutting that much material out. The second thing to keep in mind is that the blade spins in a counterclockwise direction. The biggest problem you're ever going to run into when working with one of these is that you are not putting resistance against the spin of the blade. So when you're cutting this piece, you want to be moving this way because the blade is spinning that way. If at any point, especially at the beginning, there is a bit of a temptation to just kind of put it in there straight, if you were to do that, because you are not providing that resistance consistently, when that resistance comes from the blade itself, when the force comes from that blade, it's going to push that material in a direction opposite to the one that you are pushing, and you're going to be in trouble. So even when you start, you want to be coming in and putting resistance up against it the entire way. The last safety precaution, of course, is to keep your fingers away from the material, and also keep them safe in case there is any sort of kicking that happens, which is common on routers. So I recommend using a paddle when working with material. If it's a small material, you definitely want to be using this and getting the increased friction and the protection in case something goes wrong. Your paddle is going to go into the blade rather than your hand. On a larger piece, it may not be necessary to do that because you have a lot of leverage against the blade as it's going through, or if you're making a small cut up against the fence. I'd like to start by showing you the kickback that I talked about right there. Don't follow my example there. I did this on purpose to show you using a larger piece that I knew I could control. The router bit that I am using here has a bearing at the bottom, and therefore my template is at the bottom. You can see it as the cut commences. I keep my hands placed at the two sides of the piece that I'm moving through because that gives me the most amount of leverage on the piece. I then slowly move it along in the same direction the whole way, keeping that template pushed up against the bottom bearing on the bit. Yes, I do have my vacuum on, it's just not all getting collected there, and I'll have to clean it up before I make the next pass. This blade does not cover the entire edge of the material that I'm working on, and so I'm going to have to switch out my bits. My router table has a spindle locking mechanism, so the first thing I do is release that, then I remove the protective plate so that I can change the blade. I can't reach the button easily that locks the shaft, and so I'm using 2 different wrenches here to hold the shaft in place while I loosen and then tighten the collet on the new bit. Before I can cut, the last thing that I need to do is to lower the bit down so that the bearing is touching the previously cut material. And now let me show you the proper way to start a cut like this, providing resistance against the blade even at the very beginning. The rest of the cut is performed just like the first cut. The only difference is the bearing is now at the top of the material and we had to start from the opposite end. For the example cut using a handheld router, I'm going to use a palm router like this one. And I'm going to use a bit like this roundover bit. Again, it has a bearing on it that keeps it from cutting too far into the wood, and will make a nice rounded over profile on the edge of any wood. The safety considerations are much the same, although you now have the added responsibility when you are running along the board to make sure that your router is not tipping into whatever you're cutting in any direction. That is why sometimes it's handy to have these wider plates, because it gives you a better chance of contacting with the surface area that you're working on. Depends on your application. One important note, I had mentioned earlier on the router table that the blade spins in a counterclockwise direction. Well, that's true when it's facing this way, but from your perspective, when you're working on it this way, it's spinning in a clockwise direction. The same safety information, the same safety precaution is necessary in that you're pushing with resistance against the blade. You just have to remember that it is now spinning this way, and you need to, if you're working on, say, this countertop, you need to move in this direction while it spins against you, providing resistance against that spin. Let's take a look at how that cut works. I begin by making sure that the board is held securely. And I also have to make sure that any clamps that I'm using to hold that board securely will not get in the way of my router base. The start of the cut is the trickiest part because using a base like this, I only have about 1/4 of the circle on top of the material itself. Once it's started, you just proceed along the line of the edge, keeping it pushed all the way up against the bearing and the plate flat against the top surface. Now the roundover example that I showed you could also be done on a router table like this. I did it using a palm router because some of the ends were easier to do by not having to move the piece around like I would have to on this table. But let's say you have a straight piece that doesn't have that size impediment to it, and you want to do it on your router table. Well, an easy way to do that is to set your fence up, and fences are adjustable. And if you have a bearing that you're working with, then what you can do is take any straight edge and take your fence and make sure it goes against this bearing. You can lock one side in first, make any sort of final adjustments that you need to do, then lock in the other, and you can simply slide your piece across. It's actually a very safe way to do it. You just have to remember that you're never putting your fingers anywhere near where that blade could be. And those are the absolute basics behind the safe use of a router and a router table. Like I said earlier, there is so much more that you can do with these particular tools. But I think this will give you a good start if you're a beginner to begin to understand how they work and to get a feel for them yourself. I hope you find some great projects where you can use some of the simple capabilities of this tool and all the others that I cover in my series. If you enjoyed and found useful the information that's in this particular video, please do go look for the other videos in this series. Thank you for watching. I'd love to see some of the great projects that you make. Go ahead and post them in the comments if you will. Otherwise, I'll see you in a future video.